What 17-year-old Michael Harrison was about to discover at the prestigious Whitfield Academy would expose a $45 million educational admissions fraud operation that reached the highest levels of federal judicial oversight, and put his struggling corn farming family directly in the crosshairs of corrupt educational administrators who had spent 8 years keeping these systematic bribery and grade manipulation networks buried beneath elite preparatory school programs and Ivy League university placement schemes. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from and if this grabs your attention. Make sure you're subscribed, because what 17-year-old Michael Harrison discovered at the prestigious Whitfield Academy will absolutely blow your mind. $45 million educational admissions fraud operation that reached the highest levels of federal judicial oversight and put his struggling corn farming family directly in the crosshairs of corrupt educational administrators who had spent 8 years keeping these systematic bribery and grade manipulation networks buried beneath elite preparatory school programs and Ivy League university placement schemes. But let's start from the beginning. The rolling hills of Crenshaw County, Iowa, had been home to the Harrison family corn farm for 3 generations. But 17-year-old Michael Harrison was about to become the first in his family to lose his chance at higher education, not to academic failure, financial hardship, or lack of ambition, but to a rejection letter that arrived on a humid August morning with the devastating efficiency of institutional discrimination that had systematically excluded rural students from elite educational opportunities throughout the Midwest during the previous decade. Michael possessed the kind of sharp, analytical mind and relentless work ethic that had made his grandfather successful during the farm crisis of the 1980s. But he also carried the crushing weight of being valedictorian at Crenshaw County High School, while knowing that his perfect 4.0 GPA and 1580 SAT score meant nothing to admissions committees at elite institutions that prioritize legacy connections and donor relationships over academic merit and personal character. Standing 6'1" with the lean build of someone who had spent every summer since age 14 operating heavy farm equipment and managing crop rotations under the unforgiving Iowa sun, Michael had graduated as valedictorian from Crenshaw County High School with perfect grades in advanced placement, courses that he had studied for independently because his rural school lacked the resources to offer the comprehensive college preparation programs that wealthy, suburban districts provided their students automatically. His academic achievements were particularly remarkable considering the physical demands of corn farming that required him to wake at 5 a.m. every day during planting and harvest seasons to operate machinery and manage livestock before spending 8 hours in classes, then returning home for evening farm work that often continued past 11 p.m. when equipment failures and weather emergencies demanded immediate attention regardless of homework deadlines or college application requirements. Michael's dream of attending Whitfield Academy, the most prestigious preparatory school in the Midwest, had been inspired by their recruitment materials promising merit-based admissions that recognize exceptional academic achievement regardless of economic background, marketing language that had convinced him their institution valued intellectual ability over family wealth, and social connections that determined admission at most elite educational institutions. The contrast between Whitfield Academy's stated commitment to merit-based education and the reality of modern elite admissions had become clear to Michael. Through months of research into college placement statistics that revealed systematic advantages for wealthy families who could afford test preparation, private counseling, and extracurricular programs that rural students couldn't access due to geographic isolation and financial limitations that characterize most farming communities throughout Iowa and neighboring agricultural states. The Harrison family's financial situation had been stable but never comfortable, with corn prices fluctuating unpredictably while production costs increased steadily due to corporate consolidation in agricultural equipment, to seed supply and commodity processing that had systematically eliminated profit margins for independent farming operations throughout the rural Midwest during the previous 2 decades. Michael's father, Thomas Harrison, had inherited the 320-acre corn operation from his father in 1998 with dreams of expanding production and modernizing equipment that would enable sustainable farming practices while providing economic security for his family and preserving agricultural heritage that represented 4 generations of successful land stewardship in Crenshaw County. Thomas had invested heavily in precision agriculture technology, sustainable farming practices, and organic certification programs that required significant upfront costs while promising premium prices that would justify the financial sacrifice and technical complexity of transitioning from conventional farming methods that had sustained his family's operation for decades. The organic certification process had required 3 years of reduced income. While transitioning from conventional chemical inputs to organic farming methods that were more labor-intensive and technically demanding, but promised access to premium markets that paid higher prices for sustainably produced agricultural products that met strict environmental and health standards. Michael's mother, Jennifer Harrison, had contributed to the family's financial stability through her work as a certified public accountant for agricultural businesses throughout Crenshaw County, using her expertise in farm financial management to help neighboring families navigate the complex federal programs and tax regulations that govern modern agricultural operations. Jennifer's accounting practice had provided the Harrison family with detailed understanding of how corporate consolidation and financial pressure had systematically eliminated hundreds of family farming operations throughout Iowa and neighboring states, with most failures resulting from debt service requirements rather than operational inefficiency or poor farming practices. The family's commitment to education had always been absolute, with Thomas and Jennifer viewing academic achievement as the most reliable path for ensuring their children's future success, regardless of whether they chose to continue the family farming tradition or pursue careers that required college education and professional development. Michael's academic excellence had attracted attention from guidance counselors and teachers, who recognized his exceptional intellectual ability and encouraged him to pursue educational opportunities that would maximize his potential contributions to society while providing personal fulfillment and economic security that modern farming operations could no longer guarantee for the next generation. The application to Whitfield Academy had represented Michael's most ambitious educational goal, with a prestigious preparatory school offering academic programs, college counseling, and extracurricular opportunities that could provide access to Ivy League universities and other elite institutions that rarely accepted students from rural Iowa high schools regardless of their academic qualifications. Whitfield Academy's marketing materials had emphasized their commitment to diversity and merit-based admissions that welcomed exceptional students from all economic backgrounds, with need-based financial aid programs that promised to make elite preparatory education accessible to families who couldn't afford the $55,000 annual tuition fees that typically restricted admission to wealthy suburban families. The application process had required extensive documentation of academic achievement, standardized test scores, extracurricular activities, community service, and personal essays that demonstrated intellectual curiosity and leadership potential that Whitfield Academy claimed to value above family wealth and social connections. Michael had spent months crafting application essays that highlighted his unique perspective as a rural student who had achieved academic excellence, while contributing to his family's farming operation and serving his rural community through volunteer work with agricultural education programs that introduced urban students to farming practices and rural heritage. His extracurricular achievements included president of the National Honor Society, captain of the academic decathlon team, editor of the school newspaper, and volunteer coordinator for the county 4-H program that provided agricultural education and leadership development for rural youth throughout southeastern Iowa. Michael had also earned recognition for his independent research project documenting the environmental and economic benefits of sustainable farming practices, which had been selected for presentation at the Iowa State Science Fair and had attracted attention from agricultural extension specialists at Iowa State University who recognized the sophistication of his research methodology and policy recommendations. The combination of perfect academic credentials, demonstrated leadership ability, and unique rural perspective had convinced Michael and his family that he represented exactly the kind of diverse, merit-based candidate that Whitfield Academy claimed to seek through their admissions process. The application had included letters of recommendation from teachers, who emphasized Michael's exceptional intellectual ability, his commitment to academic excellence despite the demands of farm work, and his leadership qualities that had made him a respected figure among both peers and adults in his rural community. His guidance counselor had written extensively about Michael's unique combination of academic achievement and practical experience, noting that his farming background had provided him with work ethic, problem-solving skills, and real-world knowledge that complemented his classroom excellence and would contribute valuable perspectives to any academic community. The application had also included documentation of Michael's standardized test scores that placed him in the 99th percentile nationally, particular strength in mathematics and science that reflected both his natural ability and his practical experience with the technical aspects of modern agricultural operations. Michael's personal statement had focused on his commitment to using education for addressing the economic and environmental challenges facing rural communities, with specific examples of how his farming experience had inspired his interest in sustainable agriculture, rural economic development, and educational policy that could help bridge the gap between urban and rural America. The financial aid application had provided detailed documentation of the Harrison family's income and assets, demonstrating their need for substantial assistance, while also showing their commitment to education through the sacrifices they had made to support Michael's academic achievement and college preparation. Jennifer Harrison's expertise in agricultural accounting had enabled her to present their financial situation clearly and honestly, showing how their farming operation provided a stable but modest income that made elite preparatory school tuition impossible without significant financial aid assistance. The family had calculated that even with maximum financial aid, attending Whitfield Academy would require significant sacrifice, including potential debt service that could affect their farming operations' financial stability. But they had determined that the educational opportunities justified the financial risk. Michael's acceptance to Whitfield Academy would have represented validation of merit-based education and proof that exceptional academic achievement could overcome economic disadvantages and geographic isolation that typically prevented rural students from accessing elite educational opportunities. The rejection letter that arrived on that humid August morning had shattered not only Michael's educational dreams, but also his family's faith in the fairness of American educational institutions that claim to value merit and diversity, while systematically excluding exceptional students who lacked wealth and social connections. The letter's brief, impersonal language had provided no specific explanation for the rejection, offering only generic references to competitive applicant pool. It's an holistic evaluation process that gave no indication of what factors had led to Michael's exclusion from an institution that claimed to seek exactly his type of academic excellence and diverse background. The rejection had been particularly devastating because Michael's academic credentials exceeded the published admission standards for Whitfield Academy, with his 1580 SAT score ranking in the top 1% of all test takers nationally, and his 4.0 GPA representing perfect academic performance in the most challenging courses available at his rural high school. Michael's extracurricular achievements had also met or exceeded the leadership and community service expectations that Whitfield Academy's admissions materials had identified as important factors in their holistic evaluation process that supposedly considered students' potential contributions to their academic community. The financial aid application had demonstrated clear need for assistance, while also showing the Harrison family's commitment to education and their willingness to make significant financial sacrifices to support Michael's academic opportunities. The rejection had forced Michael to confront the reality that elite educational institutions' stated commitment to diversity and merit-based admissions often masked systematic preferences for wealthy families who could afford full tuition while contributing to institutional prestige through alumni connections and donor relationships. Thomas and Jennifer Harrison had struggled to explain to their son how his exceptional academic achievement and unique rural perspective had been insufficient for admission to an institution that claimed to value exactly those qualities, while Seeking diverse student populations that included rural and agricultural backgrounds, the family had spent weeks researching Whitfield Academy's recent admissions statistics, discovering patterns that suggested systematic advantages for legacy applicants, donor families, and students from wealthy suburban districts that could afford comprehensive college preparation programs including private tutoring, test preparation, and extracurricular activities that rural students couldn't access. Michael's rejection from Whitfield Academy had represented more than personal disappointment. It had exposed the systematic inequality that characterized American elite education, where institutions maintained facades of merit-based admissions, while operating systems that perpetuated economic and social privilege across generations. The Harrison family's experience had revealed how elite preparatory schools used need-based financial aid programs as marketing tools to suggest accessibility, while maintaining admissions practices that systematically favored wealthy applicants who didn't require financial assistance and could contribute to institutional revenue through full tuition payments. Michael's perfect academic credentials had been insufficient to overcome the institutional preferences for applicants whose families could afford elite preparatory education without financial aid, despite Whitfield Academy's stated commitment to economic diversity and merit-based evaluation that supposedly prioritized academic achievement over family wealth. The rejection had also highlighted the geographic discrimination that affected rural students who lacked access to the sophisticated college preparation infrastructure that wealthy suburban communities provided automatically, creating systematic disadvantages for exceptional students from agricultural areas, regardless of their individual academic achievements. As Michael processed his rejection from Whitfield Academy and began researching alternative educational opportunities that might provide pathways to elite universities despite his exclusion from preparatory school programs, he had no idea that his experience with institutional discrimination would soon intersect with a federal investigation that would expose systematic corruption in elite educational admissions throughout the American educational establishment. Tomorrow will reveal how Michael's desperate research into Whitfield Academy's admissions practices would uncover evidence of systematic fraud that reached far beyond his personal rejection, and why his rural farming background would provide crucial insights that federal investigators needed to understand the full scope of educational corruption that had been operating in plain sight for nearly a decade. The week following Michael Harrison's rejection from Whitfield Academy had been filled with the kind of quiet devastation that rural families experienced when institutional systems failed them without explanation or recourse. The Harrison farmhouse, which had always been filled with discussions about Michael's academic future and college plans, now carried the heavy silence of dreams deferred and opportunities lost to forces beyond their understanding or control. Michael's bedroom remained exactly as it had been during his months of college. Preparation walls covered with academic achievement certificates, National Honor Society recognition, science fair awards, and printed college brochures that now seemed like relics from a more optimistic time when merit and hard work appeared to guarantee educational opportunities for exceptional students. Regardless of their economic background, the desk where Michael had spent countless hours crafting application essays and researching elite preparatory schools still held neat stacks of college guidebooks, standardized test preparation materials, and financial aid applications that represented hundreds of hours of careful preparation for educational opportunities that had been systematically denied despite his perfect academic credentials and demonstrated leadership abilities. Thomas Harrison had continued the daily routines of corn farming that had sustained his family for 3 generations. But his conversations with neighboring farmers now included bitter discussions about how educational institutions systematically excluded rural students while claiming to value diversity and merit-based admissions that promised opportunities for exceptional students from agricultural communities. The rejection had affected the entire Harrison family's understanding of American educational fairness, forcing them to confront the reality that elite institutions operated systematic preferences for wealthy families while using marketing language about diversity and accessibility to disguise discriminatory practices that perpetuated economic and social inequality across generations. Jennifer Harrison's work as an agricultural accountant had provided her with detailed knowledge of how Institutional systems often claimed to support rural families while implementing policies that systematically benefited wealthy urban and suburban clients. But the educational discrimination against Michael had represented a particularly cruel example of how elite institutions exploited rural communities. Faith in merit-based opportunity. The Harrison family's church congregation at Crenshaw County Methodist had rallied around Michael's situation with the kind of community support that characterized rural America's response to institutional injustice, with neighbors sharing their own stories of exceptional children who had been excluded from elite educational opportunities. Despite academic achievements that exceeded published admission standards, Pastor William Coleman had delivered a Sunday sermon about persistence in the face of institutional injustice, using biblical examples of ordinary people who had challenged corrupt systems while maintaining faith that truth and righteousness would ultimately prevail over systematic oppression and discrimination that violated fundamental principles of fairness and human dignity. The congregation's support had included practical assistance in researching alternative educational opportunities, with retired teachers, agricultural extension agents, and community leaders contributing their knowledge about scholarship programs, state universities, and educational pathways that might provide Michael with opportunities to pursue his academic and career goals despite his exclusion from elite preparatory institutions. Michael's former teachers at Crenshaw County High School had been particularly devastated by his rejection from Whitfield Academy, since his academic excellence had represented validation of their teaching effectiveness in their rural schools, ability to prepare students for competitive educational opportunities despite limited resources and geographic isolation that characterized most agricultural communities. Principal Margaret Foster had spent her entire career advocating for rural students and had personally mentored dozens of exceptional graduates who had achieved success at major universities and in professional careers, making Michael's rejection particularly frustrating because his academic credentials clearly exceeded the qualifications of students who had been accepted to elite institutions in previous years. The guidance counseling staff had reviewed Michael's application materials repeatedly, unable to identify any weaknesses that could explain his rejection from an institution that claimed to seek exactly his type of academic excellence. Leadership, ability, and diverse rural perspective that would contribute valuable insights to their academic community. Michael's National Honor Society advisor had contacted colleagues at other rural schools throughout Iowa and neighboring states, discovering a disturbing pattern of exceptional students being rejected from elite preparatory schools and universities, despite academic credentials that clearly met or exceeded published admission standards and institutional claims about merit-based evaluation processes. The pattern had included rural valedictorians with perfect SAT scores being rejected from institutions that had accepted less qualified students from wealthy suburban districts, suggesting systematic discrimination against agricultural communities that contradicted elite institutions' stated commitment to geographic and economic diversity in their student populations. Agricultural extension agents throughout southeastern Iowa had begun documenting cases of exceptional rural students being excluded from elite educational opportunities, recognizing that systematic educational discrimination represented a threat to rural economic development and agricultural innovation that depended on providing farming communities most talented young people with advanced educational opportunities. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the agricultural extension specialist at Iowa State University, who had recognized the quality of Michael's science fair research, has been particularly concerned about his rejection from Whitfield Academy because his work on sustainable farming practices had demonstrated exactly the kind of innovative thinking that agricultural communities needed to address environmental and economic challenges facing modern farming operations. Dr. Mitchell had contacted colleagues at land-grant universities throughout the Midwest, sharing information about Michael's research capabilities and seeking alternative educational opportunities that might provide him with advanced training in agricultural science and rural economic development. Despite his exclusion from elite preparatory school programs, the Iowa State University Agricultural Education Department had expressed strong interest in recruiting Michael for their honors program, recognizing that his combination of practical farming experience and academic excellence made him an ideal Candidate for research projects addressing agricultural sustainability and rural economic development challenges. Professor James Anderson, who directed Iowa State's Agricultural Honors Program, had personally contacted the Harrison family to discuss educational opportunities that would enable Michael to pursue advanced research in sustainable agriculture, while contributing to policy development that could benefit farming communities throughout the Midwest and other agricultural regions. The conversation with Professor Anderson had provided the Harrison family with renewed hope about Michael's educational future, while also revealing how elite preparatory schools, systematic exclusion of rural students deprived agricultural research, programs of exceptionally qualified candidates who could contribute valuable perspectives to addressing modern farming challenges. Michael's rejection from Whitfield Academy had also attracted attention from advocacy organizations that monitored educational discrimination and worked to ensure equal access to educational opportunities for students from all economic and geographic backgrounds, regardless of their family's ability to pay elite institution tuition or provide sophisticated college preparation support. The Rural Education Rights Coalition had documented hundreds of cases similar to Michael's situation, where exceptional students from agricultural communities have been systematically excluded from elite educational institutions despite academic credentials that clearly met admission standards and despite institutions' stated commitments to diversity and merit-based evaluation processes. Coalition researchers had identified patterns suggesting that elite preparatory schools and universities operated informal quotas that limited admission of rural students while maintaining facades of geographic diversity through acceptance of small numbers of agricultural students who typically came from wealthy farming families. Rather than working agricultural operations like the Harrison farm, the systematic nature of rural educational discrimination had become clear. Through statistical analysis revealing that exceptional students from farming communities were rejected at much higher rates than similarly qualified applicants from wealthy suburban districts, even when rural students demonstrated superior academic achievement and leadership abilities. Legal experts working with educational rights organizations had identified potential civil rights violations in admissions practices that systematically excluded rural students while claiming to operate merit-based evaluation processes. Proving discrimination required extensive documentation of institutional practices that were carefully concealed behind claims of holistic evaluation and competitive applicant pools. Michael's situation had provided educational rights advocates with a particularly clear example of systematic discrimination. Since his academic credentials were so exceptional that his rejection from an institution claiming to seek merit-based diversity could only be explained by systematic preferences for wealthy applicants who didn't require financial aid assistance. The Harrison family had been contacted by several advocacy organizations offering legal assistance and research support for challenging Whitfield Academy's admissions practices, though such legal action would require years of expensive litigation that could bankrupt farming families, while providing uncertain prospects for meaningful change in institutional discrimination. Michael had spent hours researching Whitfield Academy's recent admissions statistics through public records and alumni databases, discovering information that revealed disturbing patterns in their acceptance rates for different categories of applicants that contradicted their marketing claims about merit-based evaluation and economic diversity. The research had revealed that over 60% of Whitfield Academy's recent admissions had gone to legacy applicants, whose families had attended the institution or donated significant amounts of money, while less than 5% of accepted students came from rural agricultural communities despite the Midwest's large farming population and the institution's stated commitment to geographic diversity. Analysis of standardized test score distributions among accepted students had shown that legacy and donor family applicants were regularly accepted with significantly lower academic credentials than rural applicants who were rejected, providing clear evidence of systematic preferences that contradicted merit-based admissions claims. Financial aid data had revealed that most of Whitfield Academy's need-based assistance went to middle-class suburban families rather than truly low-income rural students, suggesting that their financial aid programs served primarily as marketing tools rather than genuine efforts to provide educational access for economically disadvantaged exceptional students. The admissions timeline analysis had shown that legacy and donor family applications were often processed much more quickly than applications from rural students, with many wealthy applicants receiving acceptance notifications within weeks, while rural students typically waited months before receiving rejections that provided no specific explanations for their exclusion. Michael's research had also uncovered concerning patterns in Whitfield Academy's relationships with college preparation services, standardized test preparation companies, and educational consultants that were primarily available to wealthy suburban families but inaccessible to rural students due to geographic isolation and cost, barriers that systematically disadvantaged agricultural communities. The investigation had revealed that many accepted students had benefited from expensive college preparation services that cost more than the Harrison family's annual discretionary income, creating systematic advantages for wealthy applicants, while disadvantaging exceptional rural students who achieve superior academic results without access to sophisticated preparation infrastructure. Social media analysis of recently accepted Whitfield Academy students had revealed lifestyle patterns and family backgrounds that clearly indicated wealth and social privilege, with many students posting about expensive vacations, luxury vehicles, and exclusive social events that contrasted sharply with the working agricultural background that Michael had highlighted in his application essays. The contrast between accepted students' backgrounds and Michael's rural farming experience had made clear that Whitfield Academy's claims about seeking diverse perspectives and merit-based admissions were marketing deceptions designed to disguise systematic preferences for wealthy families who could afford full tuition without financial aid assistance. Michael's documentation of systematic discrimination had created a comprehensive database of evidence showing how elite preparatory institutions operated fraudulent admissions processes that violated their stated policies while exploiting federal tax benefits and charitable status that were supposed to ensure educational institutions served genuine public interest rather than wealthy donor preferences. The evidence had included detailed analysis of admission rates, standardized test score comparisons, financial aid distribution patterns, timeline analysis, and demographic research that clearly demonstrated systematic discrimination against rural students despite institutional claims about merit-based evaluation and commitment to geographic and economic diversity. As Michael compiled his research into systematic admissions fraud at Whitfield Academy, had no idea that his documentation would soon attract attention from federal investigators who had been monitoring elite educational institutions for evidence of systematic corruption that violated federal laws governing educational discrimination and charitable organization requirements. The research project that had begun as Michael's attempt to understand his personal rejection would soon become crucial evidence in a federal investigation that would expose the largest educational fraud operation in American history, with systematic corruption reaching far beyond individual institutions to encompass coordinated discrimination networks operating throughout elite preparatory and university admissions systems. Michael's rural farming background, which had been systematically devalued by elite educational institutions, would prove to be exactly the kind of authentic perspective that federal investigators needed to understand how agricultural communities had been targeted for systematic exploitation by corrupt educational administrators who had spent years concealing their fraudulent practices behind marketing claims about diversity and merit-based opportunity. Tomorrow, we'll reveal how Michael's research documentation would attract attention from an unexpected source, and why his rural Iowa perspective would prove crucial for exposing educational corruption that federal agencies had been investigating for over 2 years without understanding the full scope of systematic discrimination against agricultural communities. What the admissions committee at Whitfield Academy had failed to recognize during their systematic rejection of Michael Harrison was that his rural farming background had provided him with an extraordinary combination of analytical skills, investigative persistence, and technological expertise that made him uniquely qualified to expose the sophisticated fraud operations they had been concealing behind their elite educational facade. Michael's years of managing precision agriculture Technology on his family's corn farm had required him to develop advanced skills in data analysis, statistical modeling, and system troubleshooting that far exceeded the technological capabilities of most students his age, including the wealthy suburban applicants that Whitfield Academy systematically favored over rural candidates with superior academic credentials. The Harrison family's transition to organic farming practices had required Michael to master complex environmental monitoring systems, soil analysis, databases, and crop management software that demanded the same analytical thinking and attention to detail that characterized advanced academic research, though elite educational institutions systematically undervalued practical, technological experience compared to expensive extracurricular programs accessible only to wealthy families. Michael's responsibility for managing the farm's financial records and regulatory compliance had provided him with sophisticated understanding of institutional documentation, bureaucratic procedures, and legal requirements that enabled him to navigate complex administrative systems with a kind of expertise that most 17-year-olds couldn't develop without real-world experience managing significant operational responsibilities. His work with agricultural extension programs had required him to research federal regulations, analyze policy implications, and communicate technical information to diverse audiences, including farmers, government officials, and academic researchers, developing professional communication skills that exceeded the capabilities of students whose extracurricular activities consisted primarily of expensive recreational programs rather than substantive leadership responsibilities. The precision agriculture technology that Michael had learned to operate included GPS-guided planting systems, variable rate fertilizer applications, and automated irrigation controls that required understanding complex software interfaces, troubleshooting technical problems, and optimizing system performance through careful analysis of data patterns and environmental variables. Michael's experience with agricultural databases had taught him to identify patterns in complex datasets, recognize statistical anomalies, and extract meaningful insights from large amounts of information, skills that were directly applicable to analyzing institutional admissions data and detecting systematic discrimination patterns that less technically experienced students might miss. His work managing crop insurance claims and federal agricultural program applications had required him to document compliance with detailed regulatory requirements, maintain precise records of operational activities, and present evidence in formats that satisfied bureaucratic standards, providing him with exactly the kind of investigative and documentation skills needed to expose institutional fraud. The 4-H leadership positions that Michael had held throughout high school had required him to organize community events, coordinate volunteer activities, and manage budgets for educational programs, developing project management and organizational skills that enabled him to conduct comprehensive research projects with the kind of systematic approach that characterized professional investigations. Michael's independent research project on sustainable farming practices had required him to review hundreds of academic papers, analyze conflicting data sources, and synthesize complex information into coherent policy recommendations, demonstrating research capabilities that exceeded the requirements of most college-level coursework. Despite his exclusion from elite preparatory programs, the science fair recognition that Michael had received for his agricultural research reflected his ability to identify important problems, develop innovative solutions, and present findings in formats that communicated technical information to both expert and general audiences, skills that were directly applicable to exposing educational fraud and presenting evidence to policymakers and legal authorities. Michael's experience working with Iowa State University agricultural extension specialists had exposed him to academic research methodologies, peer review processes, and professional standards for evidence evaluation that provided him with sophisticated understanding of how institutional systems operated and how systematic problems could be documented and addressed through appropriate channels. The Rural Education Rights Coalition's interest in Michael's situation had connected him with legal experts and advocacy, professionals who recognized that his analytical skills and research capabilities made him uniquely qualified to assist with documenting systematic discrimination against rural students throughout elite educational institutions. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the agricultural extension specialist who had mentored Michael's research project, had encouraged him to apply his analytical skills to investigating educational discrimination, recognizing that his combination of technical expertise and personal experience with institutional bias provided valuable qualifications for exposing systematic problems affecting rural communities. Michael's research into Whitfield Academy's admissions practices had revealed his exceptional ability to navigate institutional databases, analyze statistical patterns, and identify discrepancies between stated policies and actual practices, demonstrating investigative capabilities that exceeded the qualifications of many professional researchers studying educational discrimination. The comprehensive documentation that Michael had compiled about systematic discrimination at Whitfield Academy had impressed educational rights advocates with its thoroughness, analytical sophistication, and attention to detail, leading several organizations to invite him to expand his research to include other elite preparatory institutions throughout the Midwest. Michael's ability to identify patterns in admissions data had enabled him to detect systematic preferences for legacy applicants, donor families, and wealthy suburban students that were carefully concealed behind claims of holistic evaluation, and merit-based diversity, revealing fraud patterns that had escaped detection by less analytically skilled observers. The social media analysis that Michael had conducted to verify the backgrounds of recently accepted Whitfield Academy students had demonstrated his understanding of digital investigation techniques and his ability to cross-reference multiple information sources to verify institutional claims about student diversity and merit-based admissions. Michael's documentation of timeline patterns in admissions processing had revealed systematic differences in how applications from different demographic categories were handled, providing evidence of discriminatory practices that violated federal laws governing educational institutions that received public funding or claimed tax-exempt charitable status. The financial aid analysis that Michael had conducted had exposed how Whitfield Academy's supposed need-based assistance programs actually served to benefit middle-class suburban families rather than genuinely disadvantaged rural students. Systematic fraud in how the institution reported its charitable activities to federal oversight agencies. Michael's research had also uncovered concerning relationships between Whitfield Academy and expensive college preparation services that created systematic advantages for wealthy applicants while disadvantaging rural students who couldn't access such services, suggesting coordinated discrimination networks that extended beyond individual institutional practices. The database of evidence that Michael had compiled included detailed spreadsheets, statistical analyses, timeline documentation, and cross-referenced verification that demonstrated the kind of systematic approach to investigation that characterized professional law enforcement and academic research. Despite his exclusion from elite educational programs that claimed to develop such capabilities, Michael's work had attracted attention from rural advocacy organizations throughout the Midwest that recognized his analytical skills and research capabilities as valuable assets for documenting systematic discrimination against agricultural communities, leading to invitations to contribute to broader research projects investigating educational inequality. The American Farm Bureau's Federation's Education Committee had contacted the Harrison family after learning about Michael's research, expressing interest in supporting his investigation into systematic discrimination against rural students and offering resources for expanding his documentation to include discrimination patterns at other elite institutions. Professor James Anderson at Iowa State University's Agricultural Honors Program had reviewed Michael's admissions research and had been impressed with its methodological sophistication and policy implications, offering Michael opportunities to continue his investigation as part of official academic research projects that could influence federal education policy. The National Rural Education Association had invited Michael to present his findings at their annual conference, recognizing that his research provided crucial evidence for policy advocacy efforts seeking to address systematic discrimination against rural students in elite educational admissions processes. Michael's technological skills had enabled him to create sophisticated databases and analytical tools that could be used by other researchers investigating educational discrimination, providing valuable resources for advocacy organizations that lacked access to advanced technical capabilities for conducting comprehensive institutional analysis. The programming skills that Michael had developed for managing agricultural databases had enabled him to create automated systems for collecting and analyzing admissions data from multiple institutions, providing capabilities for conducting large-scale research into systematic discrimination patterns throughout elite educational establishments. Michael's understanding of statistical analysis and pattern recognition had enabled him to identify subtle indicators of discrimination that might escape detection by researchers without his technical background, providing advocacy organizations with enhanced capabilities for documenting systematic institutional bias. The agricultural economics knowledge that Michael had developed through his family's farming operation had provided him with sophisticated understanding of how institutional systems could be manipulated to benefit certain constituencies while systematically excluding others, insights that were directly applicable to understanding educational discrimination patterns. Michael's experience with federal agricultural programs had taught him to recognize how bureaucratic systems could be designed to appear fair while actually benefiting wealthy participants at the expense of genuinely disadvantaged applicants, providing him with exactly the kind of institutional analysis skills needed to expose educational fraud. The grant application experience that Michael had gained through agricultural program participation had provided him with understanding of how institutions could manipulate reporting requirements to disguise discriminatory practices while maintaining eligibility for federal funding and tax benefits that were supposed to ensure compliance with anti-discrimination laws. Michael's research had also revealed his exceptional ability to communicate complex technical information to diverse audiences. With his documentation of systematic discrimination being accessible to legal experts, policymakers, and general audiences, despite the sophisticated analytical methods used to expose institutional fraud, the presentation skills that Michael had developed through 4-H leadership and science fair participation had enabled him to effectively communicate his research findings to advocacy organizations, legal experts, and policymakers who recognized the value of his analytical work for advancing educational equity initiatives. Michael's writing abilities, which had been demonstrated through his exceptional application essays and research reports, enabled him to create compelling documentation of systematic discrimination that could be used for legal proceedings, policy, advocacy, and public education about institutional bias affecting rural communities. The combination of technical expertise, investigative skills, communication abilities, and personal experience with discrimination had made Michael uniquely qualified to contribute to efforts for exposing and addressing systematic educational fraud, despite his exclusion from elite institutions that claim to develop such capabilities. As Michael's research into systematic admissions fraud attracted increasing attention from advocacy organizations, legal experts, and academic researchers, he had no idea that his documentation had already been noticed by federal investigators, who had been monitoring elite educational institutions for evidence of systematic corruption that violated federal laws governing discrimination and charitable organization requirements. The analytical skills that Whitfield Academy had systematically undervalued in favor of wealthy applicants with inferior academic credentials would soon prove to be exactly the qualifications that federal law enforcement needed to understand and prosecute the largest educational fraud operation in American history. Michael's rural farming background, which elite institutions had dismissed as incompatible with their sophisticated academic culture, would provide federal investigators with crucial insights into how systematic discrimination operated and how corrupt educational administrators had exploited agricultural communities while concealing their fraudulent practices behind marketing claims about diversity and merit-based opportunity. The systematic discrimination that Michael Harrison had experienced at Whitfield Academy represented the culmination of an 8-year transformation in elite educational admissions that had fundamentally corrupted merit-based evaluation processes, while creating sophisticated fraud networks that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal revenue for corrupt administrators, missions consultants, and complicit institutional leadership throughout the American educational establishment. The corruption had begun in 2016 when Whitfield Academy's Board of Trustees had hired Dr. Victoria Sterling as Director of Admissions. specifically recruiting her from a private consulting firm that specialized in maximizing institutional revenue. Through strategic admissions practices that prioritized wealthy applicants, while maintaining facades of diversity and merit-based evaluation that satisfied federal oversight requirements and preserved tax-exempt charitable status. Dr. Sterling's previous experience at Sterling Educational Consulting had involved developing systematic methods for ensuring admission of wealthy clients to elite institutions, while providing legal cover for discriminatory practices through carefully crafted evaluation procedures that appeared objective, while actually serving to exclude qualified applicants who couldn't afford expensive preparation services or substantial institutional donations. The consulting firm's business model had depended on maintaining relationships with corrupt admissions officials at dozens of elite preparatory schools and universities throughout the country, creating coordinated networks that shared information about applicant backgrounds, family wealth, and donation potential while systematically excluding exceptional students from middle-class and working-class families, regardless of their academic qualifications. Sterling Educational Consulting had charged wealthy families between $50,000 and $200,000 for comprehensive admission services that included not only application preparation and test coaching, but also direct coordination with corrupt admissions officials who could guarantee acceptance in exchange for specified donation amounts that were structured to avoid triggering federal oversight of charitable contributions. The systematic nature of the corruption had enabled Sterling Educational Consulting to develop sophisticated methods for identifying and recruiting families with sufficient wealth to afford their premium services, while also ensuring that participating institutions receive substantial financial benefits that justified their cooperation with fraudulent admissions practices. Dr. Sterling's appointment as Whitfield Academy's Director of Admissions had been part of a broader strategy to transform the institution from a genuinely merit-based preparatory school into a revenue-generating operation that used educational credentials to legitimize systematic wealth transfer from corrupt families to institutional administrators, who were willing to sell admission spots to the highest bidders. The transformation had required careful restructuring of Whitfield Academy's admissions evaluation procedures to create systematic advantages for wealthy applicants, while maintaining legal cover for discriminatory practices through policies that appeared neutral but actually served to exclude qualified candidates who lacked access to expensive preparation services and insider knowledge about institutional preferences. The new admissions procedures had included requirements for extensive extracurricular documentation that favored students whose families could afford expensive programs, travel opportunities, and private coaching that were inaccessible to rural and working-class families despite their children's superior academic achievement and demonstrated leadership abilities. Standardized test score requirements had been manipulated through partnerships with expensive preparation services that provided wealthy students with access to actual test questions and coaching strategies that enabled score improvements that couldn't be achieved through legitimate preparation methods, creating systematic advantages that appeared to be merit-based while actually reflecting economic privilege and institutional corruption. The holistic evaluation process that Whitfield Academy had implemented under Dr. Sterling's leadership had included subjective criteria that enabled admissions officials to reject qualified applicants for arbitrary reasons, while accepting less qualified wealthy candidates whose families had demonstrated willingness to provide substantial institutional donations beyond standard tuition payments. Financial aid policies had been restructured to create the appearance of economic diversity, while actually directing most assistance to middle-class suburban families whose parents worked in industries that could provide networking benefits for Whitfield Academy's wealthy donor base, ensuring that genuinely disadvantaged rural and urban students remained excluded despite their exceptional academic qualifications. The institutional changes had been coordinated with similar transformations at dozens of other elite preparatory schools throughout the country, creating systematic networks that shared information about wealthy families while ensuring that qualified students from non-wealthy backgrounds faced consistent rejection regardless of which elite institutions they applied to for educational opportunities. Dr. Sterling's corruption network had included relationships with admissions officials at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, and other elite universities who coordinated their acceptance decisions to ensure that wealthy families who had purchased preparatory school admissions also received guaranteed university placement in exchange for additional donation commitments that were structured as legitimate charitable contributions. The coordination between preparatory schools and universities had enabled corrupt administrators to charge premium prices for comprehensive educational packages that included both secondary and higher education placement, generating millions of dollars in illegal revenue while systematically excluding qualified students whose families couldn't afford to purchase educational opportunities. The legal structure of the corruption had been designed by attorneys who specialized in educational law and tax regulations, ensuring that fraudulent practices appeared to comply with federal requirements governing charitable organizations while actually violating numerous laws related to discrimination, fraud, tax evasion that could result in criminal prosecution if properly investigated. The financial mechanisms used to disguise bribery payments had included fake charitable foundations, consulting contracts for non-existent services, and donation arrangements that provided wealthy families with tax benefits while enabling institutional administrators to receive personal financial benefits through carefully structured compensation packages that appeared legitimate. Dr. Sterling's personal compensation at Whitfield Academy had increased from $150,000 annually to over $400,000 within 3 years, reflecting bonuses and incentive payments that were directly tied to her success in recruiting wealthy families, and increasing institutional revenue through systematic admissions fraud that generated millions of dollars in additional donation income. The transformation of Whitfield Academy's admissions practices had eliminated merit-based evaluation entirely, with Dr. Sterling's internal communications revealing that academic credentials and student qualifications had become secondary considerations compared to family wealth and donation potential when making acceptance decisions that determined students' educational opportunities. Internal documents from Dr. Sterling's administration had included explicit instructions to admissions staff about prioritizing legacy applicants, donor families, and wealthy suburbanites, while systematically rejecting rural and working class candidates regardless of their academic achievements, leadership abilities, or potential contributions to institutional diversity. The systematic discrimination against rural students had been particularly pronounced because agricultural communities lacked the political influence and media attention that might have exposed institutional corruption, making farming families ideal targets for exploitation while minimizing risks of public scrutiny or legal challenges that could threaten the fraudulent operation. Statistical analysis of Whitfield Academy's admissions patterns during Dr. Sterling's tenure had revealed dramatic changes in student demographics, with rural representation declining from 15% to less than 3%, while legacy and donor family admissions increased from 30% to over 65%. Despite the institution's marketing claims about maintaining commitment to geographic and economic diversity, the average standardized test scores of accepted students had actually declined during Dr. Sterling's administration, reflecting the systematic acceptance of less qualified wealthy applicants, while exceptional rural and working-class students were rejected. Contradicting institutional claims about maintaining academic excellence and merit-based evaluation standards, financial aid distribution patterns had revealed that most assistance went to families with annual incomes between $150,000 and $300,000 rather than genuinely disadvantaged students, suggesting that aid programs served primarily as marketing tools, rather than authentic efforts to provide educational access for economically disadvantaged exceptional students. The corruption at Whitfield Academy had been coordinated with similar fraudulent operations at over 40 elite preparatory schools throughout the country, creating systematic networks that ensured qualified students from non-wealthy backgrounds faced consistent exclusion while wealthy families could purchase guaranteed educational placement for their children, regardless of academic qualifications. Federal tax records had revealed that participating institutions had received hundreds of millions of dollars in donations from families whose children had been accepted through fraudulent admissions processes, with donation patterns suggesting systematic coordination between admissions decisions and financial contributions that violated numerous federal laws governing educational institutions and charitable organizations. The corruption network had also included relationships with standardized testing organizations, college preparation services, and educational consulting firms that created comprehensive systems for ensuring wealthy students receive systematic advantages throughout the admissions process, while qualified students from modest backgrounds faced insurmountable disadvantages regardless of their academic achievements. Dr. Sterling's operation had generated an estimated $45 million in fraudulent revenue during her 8-year tenure at Whitfield Academy, with corrupt practices extending to dozens of other institutions that had adopted similar systematic discrimination policies in exchange for substantial increases in donation revenue and administrative compensation packages. The legal exposure created by these fraudulent practices had been substantial, with potential criminal charges including fraud, conspiracy, civil rights violations, and tax evasion that could result in decades of imprisonment for participating. Administrators and forfeiture of assets acquired through systematic educational corruption. The federal investigation that had been monitoring these activities had begun in 2019 when Department of Education auditors had identified suspicious patterns in financial aid, distribution, and admissions statistics at multiple elite institutions that suggested coordinated discrimination against specific demographic groups, including rural students, working-class families, and certain ethnic minorities. The investigation had been complicated by the sophisticated legal structures that corrupt administrators had developed to disguise their fraudulent practices, requiring extensive forensic accounting and pattern analysis to identify systematic discrimination that appeared to comply with federal regulations while actually violating numerous civil rights and fraud statutes. Federal investigators had been particularly interested in documenting how systematic discrimination against rural communities had been implemented and concealed. Recognizing that agricultural families represented a vulnerable population that lacked political influence and media attention necessary to expose institutional corruption through traditional advocacy channels, the Department of Education's Office of Inspector General had been coordinating with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division to develop criminal cases against corrupt educational administrators while also preparing civil enforcement actions that could result in substantial financial penalties and loss of federal funding for participating institutions. The investigation had been significantly enhanced by the comprehensive documentation that Michael Harrison had compiled about systematic discrimination at Whitfield Academy, providing federal investigators with detailed evidence about how fraudulent practices operated and how corrupt administrators had concealed their activities. Behind claims of merit-based evaluation and institutional diversity, Michael's research had revealed patterns and methodologies that federal investigators had been unable to document through traditional oversight mechanisms, demonstrating how rural students' analytical capabilities and investigative persistence could provide crucial insights into systematic corruption that had escaped detection by conventional federal monitoring procedures. The evidence that Michael had compiled had included detailed statistical analysis, timeline documentation, and cross-referenced verification that met federal standards for criminal prosecution while also providing policy insights that could be used to prevent similar corruption in future educational admissions processes. Federal investigators had recognized that Michael's unique combination of analytical skills, personal experience with discrimination, a rural perspective, made him an invaluable asset for understanding how systematic educational fraud had operated, while developing effective enforcement strategies that could protect vulnerable communities from continued exploitation. As federal agencies prepared to implement the largest educational fraud prosecution in American history, they had identified Michael Harrison as a crucial witness, whose documentation and analytical capabilities would be essential for ensuring successful criminal convictions while also developing policy reforms that could prevent similar systematic corruption in elite educational institutions. The investigation that had begun with Michael's personal rejection from Whitfield Academy was about to expose systematic corruption that had affected thousands of students and generated hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal revenue while systematically excluding qualified candidates from rural and working-class families throughout the American educational establishment. Michael Harrison's comprehensive research into systematic admissions fraud at Whitfield Academy had provided him with devastating evidence of institutional corruption, but transforming his documentation into actionable change would require a strategic approach that could overcome the legal protections and political influence that had enabled elite educational institutions to operate fraudulent practices without accountability for nearly a decade. The challenge facing Michael was that his evidence, despite its analytical sophistication and comprehensive scope, represented the testimony of a 17-year-old rural student against some of the most prestigious and legally protected institutions in American education, with corrupt administrators having access to expensive legal representation and political connections that could easily discredit or suppress his research findings. Michael's strategy would need to navigate complex legal requirements for exposing institutional fraud while also building sufficient credibility and support to ensure that his documentation received serious consideration from federal oversight agencies that had historically been reluctant to challenge elite educational institutions due to their political influence and charitable status. The first component of Michael's strategy involved expanding his research beyond Whitfield Academy to include systematic analysis of admissions patterns at dozens of other elite preparatory schools throughout the Midwest and East Coast. Evidence that the corruption represented coordinated networks rather than isolated institutional problems that could be dismissed as aberrations or misunderstandings. Michael's technological capabilities had enabled him to develop automated systems for collecting and analyzing admissions data from multiple institutions simultaneously, creating comprehensive databases that revealed systematic discrimination patterns across geographic regions and institutional categories. While demonstrating the coordinated nature of educational fraud operations, the data collection process had required Michael to master sophisticated web scraping techniques, database management systems, and statistical analysis software that enabled him to process thousands of admissions records while identifying patterns that would be impossible to detect through manual research methods or traditional oversight procedures. Michael's agricultural technology background had provided him with exactly the kind of systems thinking and process optimization skills needed to develop efficient research methodologies that could analyze massive amounts of institutional data, while maintaining accuracy and reliability that would meet federal standards for criminal evidence. The expansion of Michael's research had revealed systematic discrimination patterns at over 30 elite preparatory schools, with statistical evidence showing coordinated policies that systematically excluded rural students while favoring wealthy, suburban applicants regardless of academic qualifications or merit-based evaluation criteria that institutions claimed to implement. Cross-institutional analysis had revealed sophisticated coordination mechanisms that enabled corrupt admissions officials to share information about wealthy families while ensuring that qualified students from non-wealthy backgrounds faced consistent rejection across multiple institutions, creating systematic barriers to elite educational access that violated federal civil rights laws. The research had also documented extensive relationships between elite preparatory schools and expensive college consulting services that created systematic advantages for wealthy applicants while disadvantaging students who couldn't afford professional assistance, revealing coordinated business networks that facilitated systematic discrimination. While generating substantial illegal revenue, Michael's documentation had included detailed analysis of financial flows between wealthy families, consulting services, and educational institutions that revealed systematic bribery and money laundering operations disguised as legitimate charitable donations and educational services, providing evidence that met federal standards for criminal prosecution under fraud and corruption statutes. The second component of Michael's strategy involved building relationships with advocacy organizations, legal experts, and academic researchers who could provide credibility and institutional support for his findings, while also contributing additional expertise and resources that would be necessary for challenging powerful educational institutions through legal and regulatory channels. the Rural Education Rights Coalition had provided Michael with access to legal experts who specialized in educational discrimination cases, enabling him to understand the specific federal laws and regulatory requirements that elite institutions had violated through their systematic exclusion of qualified rural students. Legal analysis had revealed that the documented discrimination patterns violated multiple federal statutes, including the Civil Rights Act, federal education funding requirements, and tax regulations governing charitable organizations, providing multiple avenues for criminal prosecution and civil enforcement, actions that could result in substantial penalties for participating institutions. The American Civil Liberties Union's Education Division had reviewed Michael's research and had confirmed that his documentation provided sufficient evidence for federal civil rights violations, offering legal support for potential litigation, while also contributing their expertise in educational discrimination law to strengthen the evidentiary foundation for prosecution efforts. Academic researchers at land-grant universities throughout the Midwest had expressed strong interest in Michael's findings, recognizing that his documentation provided crucial evidence for understanding how systematic discrimination against rural communities had been implemented and concealed by elite educational institutions. Professor Susan Chen at the University of Illinois had invited Michael to collaborate on a comprehensive academic study of rural educational discrimination that would be published in peer-reviewed journals while also providing additional credibility. For his findings through institutional academic endorsement and scholarly validation, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had also expressed interest in Michael's research, recognizing that the systematic discrimination he had documented affected not only rural communities, but also urban minority students who lacked access to expensive college preparation services and wealthy family connections that facilitated admission to elite institutions. Coalition building had enabled Michael to demonstrate that his findings represented broader patterns of systematic discrimination that affected multiple vulnerable communities, providing political and legal advantages that would be crucial for ensuring that federal oversight agencies took his documentation seriously and implemented appropriate enforcement actions. The third component of Michael's strategy involved developing comprehensive policy recommendations that could address the systematic problems he had identified, while also providing federal agencies with specific implementation strategies that would prevent similar corruption from continuing to operate in elite educational institutions. Michael's policy research had identified specific regulatory changes that could eliminate the legal loopholes and oversight gaps that had enabled systematic admissions fraud to operate without detection, providing federal agencies with detailed implementation guidance that demonstrated his understanding of both institutional problems and effective solutions. The policy recommendations had included mandatory transparency requirements for admissions procedures, standardized reporting systems for demographic and financial data, enhanced oversight mechanisms for charitable donation activities, and criminal penalties for systematic discrimination that would create sufficient deterrent effects to prevent continued fraud operations. Michael's agricultural policy background had provided him with sophisticated understanding of how federal regulatory systems could be designed to ensure compliance while also maintaining institutional flexibility, enabling him to develop policy recommendations that balanced oversight requirements with legitimate educational autonomy and academic freedom concerns. The policy development process had required Michael to research educational law, federal oversight procedures, and institutional governance structures, while also considering political feasibility and implementation challenges that could affect the success of reform efforts targeting powerful educational institutions with substantial political influence. Federal education policy experts had reviewed Michael's recommendations and had confirmed that his proposals addressed the specific legal and regulatory gaps that had enabled systematic fraud while also on supports, providing practical implementation strategies that could be adopted through existing federal oversight mechanisms without requiring extensive legislative changes. The fourth component of Michael's strategy involved developing comprehensive media and public education campaigns that could generate public awareness about systematic educational discrimination, while also creating political pressure for federal enforcement actions that might otherwise be suppressed through institutional influence and political connections. Michael's documentation had provided compelling evidence for investigative journalism that could expose systematic corruption while also building public support for federal enforcement actions that would require substantial political capital. To implement successfully against powerful educational institutions, rural media outlets throughout the Midwest had expressed strong interest in Michael's story, recognizing that systematic discrimination against farming communities represented exactly the kind of institutional bias that their audiences had experienced, but had lacked documentation and legal expertise to address through formal complaint procedures. National media organizations had also shown interest in Michael's research, recognizing that systematic educational fraud represented a significant public interest story that could generate substantial audience engagement while also serving important democratic functions by exposing institutional corruption that violated public trust and federal laws. The media strategy had included coordination with advocacy organizations and legal experts to ensure that public coverage accurately represented the legal and policy implications of Michael's findings while also protecting his personal safety and family privacy from potential retaliation by corrupt institutional administrators. Social media campaigns had enabled Michael to reach audiences that might not be served by traditional media outlets, while also building grassroots support networks that could provide political pressure for federal enforcement actions targeting systematic educational discrimination. The fifth component of Michael's strategy involved direct engagement with federal oversight agencies, including the Department of Education's Office of Inspector General, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division, and congressional oversight committees that had jurisdiction over educational institutions and civil rights enforcement. Michael's approach to federal agencies had required careful preparation to ensure that his documentation met evidentiary standards for criminal prosecution, while also demonstrating his credibility and expertise. Despite his age and rural background, that might otherwise limit his influence with federal officials, accustomed to working with institutional representatives and professional advocacy organizations. The presentation of evidence to federal agencies had included comprehensive statistical analysis, detailed timeline documentation, cross-referenced verification systems, and policy recommendations that demonstrated Michael's analytical sophistication, while also providing federal investigators with actionable intelligence that could support immediate enforcement actions. Federal officials had been particularly impressed with Michael's technological capabilities and systematic approach to documentation, recognizing that his research methodologies exceeded the quality of traditional oversight procedures while providing evidence that could support successful criminal prosecutions against corrupt educational administrators. The Department of Education's Office of Inspector General had confirmed that Michael's documentation provided sufficient evidence for federal investigation, while also acknowledging that his research had identified systematic problems that had escaped detection through conventional oversight mechanisms, demonstrating the value of his unique analytical perspective and investigative persistence. Congressional oversight staff had reviewed Michael's findings and had expressed strong interest in using his documentation for legislative hearings that could generate public awareness about systematic educational discrimination, while also creating political pressure for enhanced federal enforcement activities targeting elite institutional corruption. The sixth component of Michael's strategy involved protecting his family's safety and privacy from potential retaliation by corrupt institutional administrators who had substantial financial resources and political connections that could be used to intimidate or harass witnesses who threatened their fraudulent operations through exposure and federal prosecution. Security concerns had required Michael to work with legal experts and law enforcement officials to develop protective measures that could ensure his family's safety while also preserving the integrity of his research documentation and his ability to continue contributing to federal investigation and prosecution efforts. The Harrison family's rural isolation had provided some natural protection from potential retaliation, while also creating vulnerabilities that required specific security measures, including secure communication systems, legal representation, and coordination with local law enforcement agencies that could provide immediate response to potential threats. Federal investigators had assured Michael that witness protection protocols were available, if necessary, while also implementing security measures that could monitor potential threats from corrupt institutional administrators who might seek to prevent his testimony from contributing to successful criminal prosecutions. As Michael implemented his comprehensive strategy for exposing systematic educational fraud, he had no idea that federal investigators had already been monitoring his research activities and had been waiting for exactly his type of comprehensive documentation before implementing coordinated enforcement actions against the largest educational corruption network in American history. The analytical capabilities and investigative persistence that had enabled Michael to develop his sophisticated strategy would soon attract official federal attention. Federal enforcement actions targeting systematic institutional corruption that had operated with impunity for nearly a decade. Michael's rural farming background, which elite institutions had systematically dismissed as incompatible with sophisticated analytical work, would provide federal investigators with exactly the kind of authentic perspective and technical expertise needed to understand and prosecute educational fraud that had exploited vulnerable communities while generating hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal revenue. The morning of September 15th dawned crisp and clear across southeastern Iowa, with golden sunlight filtering through the corn stalks that surrounded the Harrison family farmhouse where Michael had spent months. What Michael didn't know, as he reviewed his latest research findings, was that his systematic exposure of institutional corruption had already triggered the largest coordinated federal enforcement operation ever implemented against elite educational institutions. At exactly 7:30 a.m., as Michael prepared for another day of high school classes at Crenshaw County High, 3 black SUVs with federal government plates turned into the gravel driveway leading to the Harrison farmhouse. The Department of Education's Office of Inspector General, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Unit, and the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Iowa. The lead vehicle carried Special Agent Patricia Morrison, a 20-year veteran of federal educational fraud investigations who had been monitoring Michael's research activities for over 6 months while building criminal cases against corrupt admissions officials at dozens of elite preparatory schools and universities throughout the country. Agent Morrison's investigation had been significantly enhanced by Michael's comprehensive documentation, which had provided federal investigators with evidence that exceeded anything they had been able to develop through traditional oversight mechanisms, demonstrating analytical capabilities that surpassed many professional investigators. Despite Michael's age and rural background, Mr. Harrison, my name is Special Agent Patricia Morrison with the Department of Education's Office of Inspector General, she announced as Michael and his parents emerged from their farmhouse with obvious concern about the unexpected federal presence at their rural property. We're here because your research into systematic admissions fraud has provided crucial evidence for the largest educational corruption investigation in federal history. The revelation that Michael's individual research project had attracted federal attention transformed the Harrison family's understanding of their son's achievements from personal vindication into contribution to national law enforcement efforts targeting systematic institutional corruption that had operated with impunity for nearly a decade. Agent Morrison's briefing revealed that federal investigators had been tracking Michael's research activities through his communications with advocacy organizations, academic researchers, and legal experts who had been cooperating with ongoing federal investigations into elite educational institutions suspected of systematic discrimination and fraud. Your documentation has provided our investigation with evidence that we've been unable to develop through conventional oversight procedures. Agent Morrison explained while displaying federal intelligence reports that revealed the scope of systematic corruption affecting dozens of elite institutions. Your analytical methods and comprehensive approach have enabled us to understand how coordinated fraud networks have been operating while avoiding detection through traditional federal monitoring systems. Over $200 million in fraudulent transactions through elite educational institutions during the previous 5 years owed systematic discrimination, affecting thousands of qualified students from rural and working-class families who had been excluded from educational opportunities while wealthy families purchased guaranteed admissions. Through sophisticated bribery and money laundering operations, Michael's research had been particularly valuable because his rural perspective and agricultural technology background had enabled him to identify patterns and methodologies that federal investigators with urban backgrounds and conventional educational experience had been unable to recognize or understand through their traditional analytical approaches. The systematic discrimination against rural communities that you've documented represents a crucial component of educational fraud that we've been investigating. Agent Morrison continued with information that revealed how Michael's personal experience had contributed to understanding broader patterns of institutional corruption. Your unique combination of analytical skills and authentic agricultural community perspective has provided insights that our urban-based investigators couldn't develop independently. Federal coordination centers throughout Washington had been implementing simultaneous enforcement actions against corrupt educational administrators, with coordinated raids and arrests occurring at elite preparatory schools and universities in 12 states. Our federal prosecutors prepared criminal indictments charging dozens of institutional officials with conspiracy, fraud, and civil rights violations. As Agent Morrison briefed the Harrison family about federal investigations, Michael's cell phone began receiving notifications about breaking news reports, describing coordinated federal raids at Whitfield Academy and dozens of other elite educational institutions throughout the country, with preliminary reports indicating that hundreds of corrupt administrators were being arrested in the largest educational fraud operation in American history. Dr. Victoria Sterling and 47 other corrupt admissions officials have been arrested this morning on federal charges, including conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and systematic violation of civil rights laws. Agent Morrison announced with satisfaction about enforcement actions that had been made possible through Michael's comprehensive research documentation. The arrests included admissions directors, institutional presidents, consulting firm executives, and wealthy families who had participated in systematic bribery schemes that had generated illegal revenue, while excluding qualified students from educational opportunities that should have been distributed based on merit rather than family wealth and political connections. Federal prosecutors had developed criminal cases that included detailed evidence of systematic discrimination, money laundering through fake charitable donations, tax evasion through fraudulent consulting contracts, and conspiracy charges that could result in decades of imprisonment for corrupt administrators who had exploited their institutional positions for personal financial gain. Your research provided the analytical foundation that enabled federal prosecutors to develop criminal cases that will result in successful convictions, while also providing policy insights that will prevent similar corruption from operating in future educational admissions processes. Agent Morrison explained with information about how Michael's work had contributed to protecting other students from systematic discrimination. The federal enforcement operation had also included asset forfeiture proceedings that would recover hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal proceeds while providing restitution for students who had been systematically excluded from educational opportunities through fraudulent admissions practices that violated their civil rights and educational opportunities. Congressional oversight committees had scheduled immediate hearings to investigate how systematic educational fraud had operated without detection through conventional federal oversight procedures, with Michael's research providing crucial documentation for legislative reforms that would prevent similar corruption from affecting future generations of students. As news of the federal enforcement operations spread throughout southeastern Iowa and national media outlets, the Harrison family found themselves at the center of a story that had transformed from personal disappointment into national validation of rural communities' analytical capabilities and contributions to protecting democratic institutions from systematic corruption. The phone at the Harrison farmhouse rang continuously throughout the morning, with calls from national media organizations, congressional oversight staff, academic researchers, and advocacy organizations seeking interviews and information about Michael's research and his family's experience with systematic educational discrimination. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, from Iowa State University's Agricultural Extension Program, called to inform Michael that his research had been selected for presentation at the National Rural Education Conference. where his documentation of systematic discrimination would be used to develop federal policy reforms protecting agricultural communities from educational fraud. Professor Susan Chen from the University of Illinois contacted the family to announce that Michael's comprehensive research would be published as the lead article in the Journal of Educational Policy, providing academic validation for his analytical methods while contributing to scholarly understanding of systematic institutional corruption affecting rural communities. The Rural Education Rights Coalition called to inform Michael that his documentation had enabled them to file federal civil rights lawsuits on behalf of hundreds of qualified rural students who had been systematically excluded from elite educational institutions, with potential damages totaling over $500 million in compensation for discrimination victims. Congressional oversight staff from the House Education and Labor Committee contacted the Harrison family to request Michael's testimony at upcoming hearings investigating systematic educational fraud, recognizing that his research provided crucial evidence for legislative reforms that could prevent similar corruption from affecting future students. The American Civil Liberties Union called to offer Michael their organization's highest recognition for contributions to civil rights protection, acknowledging that his research had exposed systematic discrimination that violated fundamental principles of educational equity and democratic opportunity. National media attention had transformed Michael's story into a symbol of rural resilience and analytical capability, with feature stories in major newspapers and television networks highlighting how a 17-year-old farmer's son had exposed corruption that had escaped detection by federal oversight agencies for nearly a decade. The attention had also attracted interest from elite universities that had previously been inaccessible to rural students, with admissions officers recognizing that Michael's research capabilities and analytical achievements exceeded the qualifications of most applicants, while his rural background provided exactly the kind of authentic diversity that their institutions claimed to seek. Harvard University's admissions office called to offer Michael guaranteed admission with full financial aid, acknowledging that his research contributions and analytical capabilities represented exactly the kind of intellectual achievement that their institution should prioritize over family wealth and social connections. Stanford University's computer science department offered Michael immediate admission to their accelerated program, recognizing that his technological capabilities and systematic analytical approach exceeded the qualifications expected from typical high school applicants, while his rural perspective would contribute valuable insights to their research community. Yale University's public policy program extended admission offers that included guaranteed graduate school placement and research funding, acknowledging that Michael's comprehensive documentation of institutional corruption provided exactly the kind of policy research capabilities that their program sought to develop and support. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology offered Michael direct admission to their undergraduate research program with full funding and immediate access to advanced analytical resources. Recognizing that his technological achievements and systematic research capabilities exceeded conventional admission criteria, while his agricultural background provided unique perspectives for interdisciplinary research. Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs offered Michael guaranteed admission with full financial aid and assured placement in their elite public policy program, acknowledging that his research achievements demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical capabilities and social commitment that their institution claimed to develop through educational opportunity. But the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source that would transform not only Michael's educational opportunities, but also his family's understanding of their connections to federal law enforcement and national security operations that had been protecting them throughout their struggle with systematic institutional discrimination. At exactly 2:30 p.m., as media attention continued to focus on the Harrison family farmhouse, a black limousine with federal judicial license plates turned into their gravel driveway, followed by two security vehicles that indicated the arrival of a high-ranking federal official whose presence suggested that Michael's research had attracted attention from the highest levels of American government. The occupant of the federal limousine was Associate Justice Margaret Thompson of the United States Supreme Court. His arrival at a rural Iowa farmhouse created immediate national media attention while revealing family connections that the Harrison family had never understood due to operational security requirements governing high-ranking federal officials. Michael, I believe it's time you learned about family connections that have been kept secret for security reasons. Justice Thompson announced as she emerged from her official vehicle with the dignified bearing that characterized Supreme Court justices, while also displaying obvious pride and affection for her nephew, whose research achievements had attracted national attention. The revelation that Michael's aunt served on the United States Supreme Court explained many aspects of federal attention that his research had received, while also revealing the sophisticated security protection that had been monitoring his family's welfare throughout their struggle with systematic educational discrimination and institutional corruption. Justice Thompson's presence at the Harrison farmhouse created immediate national news media coverage that transformed Michael's story from rural success into a broader narrative about American democratic institutions protecting exceptional individuals from systematic corruption while ensuring that merit and analytical capability were recognized regardless of economic background or geographic location. Your research has provided federal law enforcement with crucial evidence for protecting democratic institutions from systematic corruption, Justice Thompson explained with obvious pride in her nephew's achievements. Your analytical capabilities and commitment to justice represent exactly the kind of intellectual courage that American democratic institutions depend on for maintaining their integrity and effectiveness. The family connection explained why federal investigators had been monitoring Michael's research with such attention while also revealing the security considerations that had protected the Harrison family from potential retaliation by corrupt institutional administrators who might have sought to intimidate witnesses whose testimony could support criminal prosecutions. Justice Thompson's briefing revealed that systematic educational fraud represented a significant threat to American democratic institutions because it systematically excluded exceptional individuals from leadership development while concentrating power among wealthy families who purchased educational credentials rather than earning them through merit and analytical achievement. Federal investigation has determined that systematic educational fraud has affected over 50,000 qualified students during the past decade, with total financial damages exceeding $2 billion in lost educational opportunities and economic development potential. Justice Thompson announced with information about the scope of corruption that Michael's research had helped expose. The systematic exclusion of qualified rural students had been particularly damaging, because agricultural communities represented crucial sources of analytical talent and practical expertise that American institutions needed for addressing complex policy challenges related to food security, environmental protection, and rural economic development. Your research has enabled federal prosecutors to develop criminal cases that will result in substantial prison sentences for corrupt administrators, while also providing policy foundations for preventing similar fraud from affecting future generations of students. Justice Thompson continued with information about lasting impacts of Michael's analytical contributions. Congressional legislation based on Michael's research would establish permanent protections for rural students while strengthening federal oversight capabilities for detecting and prosecuting systematic institutional discrimination that violated civil rights laws and democratic principles of educational opportunity. The federal enforcement operation had resulted in criminal convictions that totaled over 400 years of imprisonment for corrupt administrators, with asset forfeiture proceedings recovering over $800 million in illegal proceeds that would provide restitution for discrimination victims while funding enhanced oversight mechanisms. International cooperation agreements had been established with allied nations to address similar educational fraud operations that had been identified in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, with Michael's analytical methods being adapted for international use in protecting democratic educational institutions from systematic corruption. The policy reforms developed through Michael's research had been adopted by over 200 educational institutions that sought to demonstrate their commitment to genuine, merit-based admissions while avoiding. Your research has enabled federal prosecutors to develop criminal cases that will result in substantial prison sentences for corrupt administrators, while also providing policy foundations for preventing similar fraud from affecting future generations. Of students, Justice Thompson continued with information about lasting impacts of Michael's analytical contributions. Congressional legislation based on Michael's research would establish permanent protections for rural students while strengthening federal oversight capabilities for detecting and prosecuting systematic institutional discrimination that violated civil rights laws and democratic principles of educational opportunity. The federal enforcement operation had resulted in criminal convictions that totaled over 400 years of imprisonment for corrupt administrators, with asset forfeiture proceedings recovering over $800 million in illegal proceeds that would provide restitution for discrimination victims while funding enhanced oversight mechanisms. International cooperation agreements had been established with allied nations to address similar educational fraud operations that had been identified in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, with Michael's analytical methods being adapted for international use in protecting democratic educational institutions from systematic corruption. The policy reforms developed through Michael's research had been adopted by over 200 educational institutions that sought to demonstrate their commitment to genuine, merit-based admissions while avoiding the legal liability and reputational damage associated with systematic discrimination practices. As Justice Thompson concluded her briefing about the national impact of Michael's research, she revealed comprehensive assistance programs that would transform not only his educational opportunities, but also his family's agricultural operation. While acknowledging their contributions to protecting American democratic institutions from systematic corruption, the federal government will provide your family with permanent agricultural development support that ensures sustainable farming operations. While recognizing your contributions to protecting democratic institutions, Justice Thompson announced, with assistance programs that exceeded the Harrison family's most optimistic expectations for security and prosperity, the agricultural assistance included $500,000 in development grants that would eliminate the family's debt, while funding farm modernization and expansion that would create sustainable economic opportunities for continued agricultural operations that preserved their farming heritage while contributing to American food security. Educational support included guaranteed admission to elite institutions with full financial aid, advanced research opportunities, and career development programs that would enable Michael to contribute to federal law enforcement while pursuing his academic interests in agricultural policy and rural economic development. Security protection would ensure the Harrison family's safety from potential retaliation, while providing ongoing federal monitoring that could prevent future targeting by corrupt interests seeking to intimidate witnesses whose testimony had contributed. 2 successful criminal prosecutions. The Harrison family farm would serve as a federal demonstration site for agricultural security programs that protected rural communities from systematic exploitation while promoting sustainable farming practices that enhanced American agricultural productivity and environmental stewardship. Michael's research capabilities had earned him immediate offers for federal service with the Department of Education's Fraud Investigation Unit, where his analytical skills and rural perspective would contribute to protecting other agricultural communities from systematic institutional discrimination and corruption. Graduate school opportunities included full funding for advanced degrees in agricultural policy, educational law, and rural economic development, with guaranteed federal employment following completion of educational programs that would prepare him for leadership roles in protecting rural communities from systematic exploitation. The Congressional Gold Medal had been authorized to recognize Michael's contributions to protecting American democratic institutions, with ceremonies scheduled at the United States Capitol that would acknowledge his analytical achievements while inspiring other young Americans to contribute to justice and institutional integrity. As national media coverage continued to focus on the Harrison family's transformation from rural struggle to national recognition, Michael's story became a powerful symbol of how individual courage and analytical capability could protect democratic institutions from systematic corruption while ensuring that merit and justice prevailed over wealth and political influence. The private school that had rejected Michael Harrison faced federal criminal charges, massive financial penalties, and complete restructuring of their admissions procedures, while Michael himself had been offered admission to every elite institution. In America, with full financial aid and guaranteed research opportunities, but more importantly, Michael's research had protected thousands of other qualified students from systematic discrimination while establishing permanent federal protections that would ensure educational opportunities were distributed based on merit rather than family wealth and social connections. The farmer's son, who had been dismissed by elite institutions as incompatible with sophisticated academic culture, had exposed the largest educational fraud operation in American history while demonstrating that rural communities possessed exactly the analytical capabilities and moral courage that democratic institutions needed for maintaining their integrity and effectiveness. Michael Harrison's mission was complete, but his work protecting American democratic institutions from systematic corruption would continue. Through federal service that honored his rural heritage while contributing to justice and opportunity for future generations of exceptional students regardless of their economic background or geographic location, the story that began with a devastating rejection letter had evolved into comprehensive protection for American educational institutions, with lasting reforms that would prevent similar corruption while ensuring that analytical merit and intellectual courage were recognized and rewarded, regardless of family wealth or social connections. Michael Thompson's legacy lived not only in the criminal convictions and policy reforms that his research had achieved, but in the knowledge that individual analytical capability and moral commitment could protect democratic institutions from systematic corruption while ensuring that justice and opportunity remained available to all Americans willing to work for them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the transformed Harrison family farm as Michael Harrison, now 18 and a freshman at Stanford University's accelerated computer science program, returned home for spring break to witness the remarkable changes that had occurred since his research had exposed the largest educational fraud operation in American history. The 320-acre corn operation that had once faced foreclosure now served as the federal agricultural security demonstration site with state-of-the-art precision farming equipment, sustainable agriculture research facilities, and an educational center that hosted delegations from around the world seeking to understand how rural communities could contribute to protecting democratic institutions from systematic corruption. Thomas and Jennifer Harrison had been transformed from struggling farmers facing bankruptcy into nationally recognized experts in agricultural security and rural education policy, with their expertise being sought by federal agencies, international organizations, and academic institutions throughout the world that recognize the value of authentic rural. Stanford University's computer science department had created a specialized research program around Michael's work, with the Harrison Rural Analytics Laboratory becoming a nationally recognized center for developing technological solutions to systematic institutional corruption while training the next generation of rural students in advanced analytical capabilities. Professor David Kim, who directed Michael's research program at Stanford, had traveled to Iowa specifically to discuss how Michael's rural background had contributed to analytical approaches that urban-educated researchers had been unable to develop independently. Recognizing that agricultural communities possessed unique perspectives that were crucial for addressing complex policy challenges, Michael's combination of agricultural technology, experience, and systematic analytical thinking has enabled him to identify patterns and develop solutions that our traditional computer science approaches couldn't achieve, Professor Kim explained. Two visiting researchers from international institutions, seeking to replicate the Harrison family's success in their own countries, the research program had attracted students from rural communities throughout the world. It's the Harrison Rural Analytics Laboratory, serving as a model for how agricultural backgrounds could contribute to advanced technological development and institutional protection in ways that elite educational establishments had systematically undervalued. Michael's freshman year at Stanford had been remarkable not only for his academic achievements, but also for his continued contributions to federal law enforcement efforts that had expanded beyond educational fraud to address systematic corruption in healthcare institutions, financial services, government contracting that exploited vulnerable communities through similar discriminatory practices. The Department of Education's Office of Inspector General had established a permanent rural outreach program based on Michael's research methods, with federal investigators now actively recruiting exceptional students from agricultural communities to contribute their analytical capabilities and authentic perspectives to protecting democratic institutions from sophisticated corruption networks. Agent Patricia Morrison, who had led the initial investigation into educational fraud, now directed the federal government's Rural Intelligence Initiative, which had identified systematic exploitation affecting farming communities in dozens of policy areas beyond education. With Michael's analytical framework providing the foundation for comprehensive federal protection programs, the Harrison family's experience demonstrated that rural communities possess exactly the analytical capabilities and moral courage that federal law enforcement needs for protecting democratic institutions. Agent Morrison explained to congressional oversight committees that we're expanding rural protection programs based on Michael's research achievements. Federal prosecution of educational fraud had resulted in criminal convictions that exceeded 600 years of total imprisonment for corrupt administrators, with asset forfeiture proceedings having recovered over $1.2 billion in illegal proceeds that were being used to fund comprehensive rural education protection programs throughout the country. Dr. Victoria Sterling, the former Whitfield Academy admissions director who had orchestrated systematic discrimination against rural students, had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, while facing additional civil liability that would require her to pay restitution to discrimination victims for the remainder of her life. Whitfield Academy itself had been fundamentally restructured under federal oversight, with new leadership implementing transparent merit-based admissions procedures while providing substantial scholarship funding specifically designated for exceptional rural students who had been systematically excluded under the corrupt previous administration. The institutional transformation had included mandatory annual reporting to federal oversight agencies, community advisory boards that included rural representation, and policy requirements that ensured geographic diversity reflected genuine commitment to educational opportunity rather than marketing deception designed to conceal systematic discrimination. Over 200 other elite educational institutions had voluntarily adopted similar reforms to avoid federal investigation and criminal prosecution, with the Harrison Standards for Transparent Admissions becoming the national benchmark for ensuring that educational opportunities were distributed based on merit rather than family wealth and political connections. Congressional legislation based on Michael's research had established permanent federal protections for rural students, with the Rural Educational Opportunity Act providing comprehensive oversight mechanisms and criminal penalties that would prevent similar systematic discrimination from affecting future generations of exceptional students from agricultural communities. The legislation had also created federal Age-L funding programs that supported rural students' access to college preparation resources, standardized test preparation, and application assistance that previously had been available only to wealthy suburban families, ensuring that geographic isolation no longer created systematic disadvantages for exceptional students. International recognition of Michael's achievements had led to invitations from educational institutions and policy organizations throughout the world, with the Harrison family's story becoming a symbol of how democratic societies could protect their most talented citizens from systematic institutional corruption, while ensuring that merit and analytical capability were recognized regardless of economic background. The United Nations had invited Michael to address their Global Education Summit, where his presentation on rural analytics and democratic protection had been attended by education ministers from over 50 countries seeking to implement similar programs for protecting their own agricultural communities from systematic discrimination and institutional exploitation. The European Union had adopted modified versions of Michael's analytical methods for investigating educational fraud in their member nations, with early results indicating systematic problems similar to those he had exposed in American institutions, demonstrating that the corruption networks had operated internationally with coordinated discrimination strategies. Justice Margaret Thompson had continued to provide family guidance while maintaining her Supreme Court responsibilities, with her pride in Michael's achievements being matched by her recognition that his rural background had contributed exactly the kind of analytical independence and moral clarity that American democratic institutions needed for maintaining their integrity. Michael's story demonstrates that exceptional analytical capability and moral courage can emerge from any community when given appropriate opportunities. Justice Thompson had written in a Supreme Court opinion that referenced rural contributions to democratic governance while establishing legal precedents for protecting vulnerable communities from systematic institutional discrimination. The Harrison family's experience had inspired documentary films, academic research, and policy studies that examined how rural communities could contribute to protecting democratic institutions while also addressing the systematic barriers that had prevented agricultural families from accessing educational and economic opportunities that reflected their actual capabilities and contributions. Michael's younger sister, Sarah, had been accepted to MIT's agricultural engineering program with full financial aid, demonstrating that the family's analytical capabilities extended beyond Michael's individual achievements, while also showing how federal protection programs could ensure that exceptional rural students received educational opportunities that matched their qualifications. The Crenshaw County High School that had educated Michael, despite limited resources, had received substantial federal funding for enhanced college preparation programs, with the Harrison Academic Excellence Initiative providing rural schools throughout Iowa with resources for ensuring that their exceptional students could compete effectively for elite educational opportunities. Principal Margaret Foster had been recognized by the Department of Education for her contributions to rural student development, with her mentoring methods being adopted by school districts throughout the Midwest that sought to replicate Crenshaw County's success in preparing exceptional students for competitive, educational opportunities despite geographic and economic disadvantages. The Rural Education Rights Coalition had established the Michael Harrison Fellowship for exceptional rural students pursuing advanced education and public policy, law enforcement, and institutional analysis, providing comprehensive support that ensured agricultural communities continued to contribute their analytical capabilities to protecting democratic institutions. Dr. Sarah Mitchell from Iowa State University had been appointed to direct the new National Rural Talent Development Initiative, a federal program that identified and supported exceptional students from agricultural communities while providing them with advanced educational opportunities that had previously been inaccessible due to systematic institutional discrimination. The Agricultural Extension Program that had first recognized Michael's research capabilities had been expanded into a national network for identifying rural analytical talent, with extension agents throughout the country receiving training in recognizing exceptional capabilities and connecting rural students with educational and career opportunities that matched their qualifications. As Michael prepared to return to Stanford for his spring quarter, he reflected on how his initial rejection from Whitfield Academy had led not only to personal vindication, but to comprehensive reforms that would protect thousands of other rural students from the systematic discrimination that had nearly destroyed his own educational opportunities. The cornfields that surrounded his family's farmhouse now represented more than agricultural heritage. They symbolized the analytical capabilities and moral courage that rural communities contributed to American democratic institutions when given opportunities to demonstrate their actual qualifications, rather than being dismissed based on economic prejudice and geographic bias. Michael's laptop computer, which had been used to compile the research that exposed educational fraud, now contained correspondence from federal agencies, international organizations, and academic institutions that continued to seek his analytical expertise while recognizing that his rural background provided irreplaceable perspectives for addressing complex policy challenges. The rejection letter from Whitfield Academy that had devastated the Harrison family less than a year earlier now served as a reminder of how institutional arrogance and systematic discrimination could be overcome through analytical persistence, moral courage, and the federal protection systems that Michael's research had helped strengthen and expand. Federal investigators had confirmed that Michael's research methods were being adapted for addressing systematic corruption in healthcare, financial services, environmental regulation, and government contracting with his rural analytical framework. providing foundations for protecting vulnerable communities from institutional exploitation in multiple policy areas. The Harrison family's story had demonstrated that exceptional analytical capability could emerge from agricultural communities when given appropriate recognition and support, while also proving that rural perspectives provided crucial insights for protecting democratic institutions from the sophisticated corruption networks that targeted vulnerable populations throughout American society. As the sun set over the transformed Harrison farm, Michael understood that his mission extended far beyond personal educational success to encompass ongoing responsibility for protecting rural communities and democratic institutions from systematic exploitation that threatened both agricultural heritage and national governance integrity. The private school that had rejected him for being incompatible with their academic culture now faced permanent federal oversight and criminal liability. While Michael himself had become a nationally recognized expert whose rural background provided exactly the analytical independence and moral clarity that elite institutions claimed to develop but had systematically excluded, Michael Harrison's legacy would endure not only through the federal protections and policy reforms that his research had achieved, but through the thousands of rural students who would receive educational opportunities because his courage had exposed systematic discrimination and ensured that merit would triumph over privilege in American educational institutions. The farmer's son, who had been dismissed by elite establishments, had protected American democracy itself, demonstrating that rural communities possess the analytical capabilities and moral courage necessary for maintaining institutional integrity, while ensuring that opportunity remained available to all citizens willing to work for justice and truth. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.